Puritan persecution, I mean, they were just as brutal, you know, some of these Protestants as the Catholics had ever been. You know, I mean, I think it was actually, I read about something, you'd probably know this a little bit better. I think it was in Ireland or something, where a Protestant, bishop or somebody brought a bunch of Catholics together for this big feast, and they thought they were going to reconcile, and then he like burned the whole building down or something, you know. And you're just like, okay, so no one's immune from this, I think, persecutory spirit.
The Lineage Journey podcast, unscripted conversations that aim to help you on the journey of discovering your lineage. Join us as we take a deeper look into past Lineage episodes and see the lessons we can learn for today.
Welcome to the Lineage Journey podcast. I have a guest here with me, Stephen Allred. I'm just using your first and last name because I know you have a couple of titles, which maybe we'll get into in just a minute. But welcome to our audience, to the Lineage Journey podcast. As those of you who tune in know, we like to interview people who are experts in the field, and we're glad to have you here, Stephen, with us. We're here in Grass Valley. I believe you live close by, right?
Yeah, we live just down the road.
Okay.
Yep.
And your bio or your background, I mean, I've known you for probably 20 plus years, but you were a pastor. Mm-hmm. And then you stepped away for a while, you retrained, and now you are...
Yeah, so I was a pastor for about 15 years or so, including seminary, and still, may go back to that someday. Got ordained, and then in the meantime, I was actually going to law school part-time at one point, and...
was it just a passion of yours?
Well, it was really because I was interested in this, in the topic of religious liberty, and I thought, this would be a good tool to have in my belt to do ministry in some area. And so I ended up working as a pastor for a while after I, went to law school, graduated, took the bar. And then when our second child was born, we kind of thought it was a good opportunity. The conference here had asked if, I wanted to take on their planned giving legal work. So anyway, I have my own law practice, and I do volunteer work in the areas of religious liberty with the union and the conference. And I find that to be an area that I'm passionate about, and get to help out with, Adventists who've lost their job because of the Sabbath, let's say, and that kind of thing, and represent them in court or whatever. So yeah.
Okay. Well, we're glad to have you here. We're going to talk about religious liberty as a general term, maybe looking at charting some of the history, but also really looking at how it applies today.
Right.
And also, the last 100 or 200 years of American history. And I think religious liberty really has a central, what would you say, place in American history, really, because that's one of the key founding principles the nation was founded on. But how would you define the term? I mean, it's maybe self-explanatory, but for someone that's not so well versed in the background of it, what would you say is a definition of it?
Yeah, I think for me, religious liberty means freedom to believe and practice according to your conscience, to the extent that your faith doesn't harm others. I put that little qualifier in there because I think there is kind of that, any right that we have, it seems like there can be limits to it. And we like to think that there aren't, but yet obviously if, a religion says, hey, we'd like to do human sacrifice, the state probably has the right to come in and say, that's not something we're going to let you do. Now, we could talk and, kind of get into the nitty gritty on that. I think for Christians, for people who believe in the Bible, I think an easy definition I found too, and it's not unique to religious liberty, is really the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And if you think about that in the context of freedom and how we afford that freedom to others, that to me is the litmus test. What would you want if you were in their shoes? I mean, if we live that way, I don't think we'd have any conflicts over religious freedom in our world.
True. So do you think, it's not really, is it a Christian concept or is it?
Religious liberty?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a concept that's shared by, it can be shared by anybody. It doesn't have to be just Christians, but I think as Christians, how do we, I guess what I'm saying is I think the golden rule can inform us, but no, it's something that we as Christians, and especially if you are coming at it from a Christian perspective, right? Do we afford that same freedom to people who don't share our beliefs, right?
That's a key question today as well that kind of is floating in the air, really.
To talk about. Yeah. Right. Because, let's be honest, I think for some folks, religious freedom means freedom to believe like I do. Right.
Yeah.
And if you don't, though, we're gonna figure out a way to stop that. And unfortunately, a lot of, I think, non-Christians, when they hear the term religious liberty or religious freedom, I think they view it as code for Christian values being imposed upon them.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, though, I think that, is not the true definition of religious freedom that we see even in the Bible, which we can get into. Like, what does God consider? He gives us freedom. He gives us the freedom to sin.
It's true.
Yeah.
If we look back on this concept in terms of where we are today, you'd say we'll get into more into that in a minute, but we're at a place, at least in America and large parts of Europe, where there's people can, in a sense, they have liberty to believe various things, and there's tolerance and all those issues as well. But if we go back in time, we look back in history, there's times when society, there wasn't much religious liberty, or there wasn't much diversity. It was just very, there was one option that you could believe when it came to religion and so on. How do we see, in the Bible times, you've got Jesus, disciples, etc. in the New Testament. As we move out of biblical times and we come into the early centuries, what are some events or key, I guess you say, key things that happen in Christianity that start the journey, or challenges as well?
Yeah, and I will, just put the caveat out there that I'm not a professional historian. It is an area of passion of mine, though, and I think that as we look back to the first centuries, right, you had a lot of persecution. Christians were persecuted. We know that
because Rome wasn't Christian yet.
Rome wasn't tolerant of any religions except for the state religion, right? And I think that of course Constantine then comes along in the 4th century or so, and basically grants toleration, which was a good thing, right? But then he takes this step farther and he says, hey, we're going to make Christianity the state religion. I was just reading something actually a couple days ago that was talking about Constantine and how historians don't believe he was actually ever really converted to Christianity until his deathbed. He got baptized right before he died. So he was kind of using it as a political tool, it seems like. In fact, apparently on his coins, he had the name of Christ on one side and the name of the sun god on the other side. And it was like he was kind of trying to hold on to his pagan beliefs, and yet he sensed there was something apparently powerful or useful in Christianity. And so he, definitely took that, and you could say exploited that. And then of course you see him establishing the first Sunday law there. 321, right? And then from there you do see the development, in later centuries after that of the papacy. Well, it was there already, right? But then the political power of the papacy came along. And so then it was, we went from pagans persecuting Christians to Christians persecuting people who didn't agree with them, the established church, right, or the state religion, whatever it was. And I think that was predicted in the Bible, right? I mean, Jesus said there's going to be a falling away in Matthew 24. Paul says in in Acts, he says in chapter 20, there's going to be grievous wolves coming in. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, of course, he predicts the rise of the man of sin and this apostasy that comes along. And so clearly, to me, part of that apostasy was this unification of church and state, where the state comes in and says, hey, religion looks like a useful thing. I mean, societies, as far back as we can look, have generally had religion and state
Desire
united.
to worship in some way, yeah.
Yeah.
So like historically, we've covered this in a lot of our lineage episodes. So you've got like a church in the Middle Ages, as you mentioned, it's a state religion. Mm-hmm. And like, as you said, they don't appreciate diversity of opinion, or, you know, like, this is the way you believe and this is the way you worship, and this is the way we all, at least in what was the modern world, what was the world then in Europe, that's the way we do it. But then we see the Reformation come along and 1500s really, and the challenges of the state church not allowing liberty to others.
Yeah, right. It's like the Reformers, I think what you're saying, right, is that even when the Protestant Reformation came along, which had a lot of good things, right, they're saying, hey, let's allow freedom of belief. But yet when you went to, you know, Germany or Switzerland or whatever territory it was, you were under the auspices of that state's religion. So they didn't really separate church and state, right?
And then, like, I mean, just to bounce off that idea, then you, like, the Anabaptists come along.
Right.
And, you know, so they're Protestant, living in a Protestant country or city like Zurich, and they want to get baptized as an adult. Anabaptist means rebaptism. And then the Protestants who've been persecuted by the Catholics, then in turn persecute the Protestants.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of...
Well, it's amazing. I was just reading a story about Puritan persecution. I mean, they were just as brutal, you know, some of these Protestants as the Catholics had ever been. You know, I mean, I think it was actually, I read about something, you probably know this a little bit better. I think it was in Ireland or something, where a Protestant, you know, bishop or somebody brought a bunch of Catholics together for this big feast, and they thought they were going to reconcile, and then he like burned the whole building down or something, you know. And you're just like, okay, so no one's immune from this, I think, persecutory spirit that can come in.
What do you think that tells us about human nature or something? That, you know, you just have these people that progress idea-wise, and then on this issue, they just fall back in the same, I don't know, same trap.
Right. You know, and I think if we look at the spirit of Scripture, you know, this is why I think when it really boils down to it, Jesus says the golden rule really sums up the law and the prophets. It sums up in Matthew 7:12. He says, you know, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. I feel like, you know, that self-giving, other-focused, I'm going to lay down my life for you, even if necessary, spirit is the essence of what it means to follow Christ. And yet, even in Protestantism, as we're coming out of, you know, the papal darkness or whatever, we still haven't gotten to that point where we're really possessing the Spirit of Christ. You know, because I think it's that conversion experience. And yeah, there was a lack of understanding, right, in a lot of these situations, because sincere people, I'm sure, and you know, they believe they were helping other people get to heaven. You know, St. Augustine, right? He thought, hey, you know, compel them to come in means you actually should try to make people good, even if they don't want to be. And, you know, we can talk later about, you know, Roger Williams and how he basically was one of the first people who said, listen, that's hypocrisy, and God doesn't want people, you're making them break the commandment that says thou shalt not bear false witness when you make them come to church, or make them act like they're a believer when they're really not.
Who was it who said, I disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it? I'm not sure.
Was that a British person? Because I'm feeling like that. Sure. I've heard that.
Heard it,
I'm not sure who.
Kind of. So we skipped though. We jumped to the Reformation, but I just wanted to ask briefly your thoughts on Magna Carta.
Well, yeah. I mean, Magna Carta was obviously.
It seems to be very well revered here in America. If you go to the place where they signed Magna Carta in England, Runnymede, there's just a field. And so we don't know where they exactly signed it. It was in that field. And then off the field, there's a monument that was erected, put up by the American Bar Association.
Oh, okay.
So the monument we have in England was paid for by Americans.
Okay.
Because the one that we had was this
know.
little block of stone in the trees, like really obscure. So I think the Americans came and saw it and said, you know, we've got to put Magna Carta in its rightful place or whatever. So what role does that play in this development, or this, you know, how monumental was it?
I think it's huge because, you know, it had this, the idea was that the king wasn't above the law, right? And that, you know, there's some accountability of the the monarch to the subjects or whatever. I mean, it wasn't. I don't think it took us all the way, but it was definitely foundational. And I've been listening to a book recently where it talked about was it William Cook, who was one of the great lawyers who really helped to establish English common law, right? And kind of the idea, or is it maybe it's Edward was his first name. I can't remember his first name. Anyway, Cook, spelled Coke. And just, I'm listening to that and thinking, man, we are so indebted to England, for really our foundations of law, just the concept of liberty. I don't think, and I think America took it to the next level when it came to individual liberty and religious liberty, right? But yeah, no, definitely Magna Carta was a big deal when it comes to establishing some really foundational principles that inform religious liberty, among other liberties today.
It's true, because Magna Carta, I think it sets the precedent. No one's above the law, trial by jury, and all those kind of things. And even if you look at John Wycliffe, I've studied. I'm sure you've read about him probably quite at length. And his ideas on, we often call him the morning star of the Reformation,
right? And
sometimes people think, well, that means that he was a little bit of light, and then the ones that came after had more. At least on my personal study of him, I kind of have a different view. Like, he had these ideas that were far ahead of his time. And like, he really believed in the separation of church and state. He felt that ministers should not be paid anything from the state.
I was unaware of that, actually. That's interesting.
Like he said the church should be disendowed. And he called the ministers civil servants, because he saw we're doing is working for the state. We're a civil servant. And the reformers 200 years later in the 1500s, they never caught that idea, like Luther. They never caught that. It's not really until the birth of the US that Wycliffe's ideas on how church ministers should operate is actually realized. But as you mentioned earlier, though, the Puritans. So let's cover those for a little bit.
Sure.
We've got, you've got Europe is one religion. It's Catholic. Then the Reformation comes along and says, no, there's Lutheranism, there's Presbyterianism, there's Anglicanism, and so on. And then in England, you've got the Church of England, and the Puritans are a movement that believes the church is not, it's not pure enough. It hasn't reformed enough. And they say, and the Church of England is now doing to them what was done to them. We're saying everyone has to go to Church of England.
Right.
And the Puritans come along and they're like, no, but and they hold a significant role in the birth of America. So, which is fascinating, because if you go to the villages where they come from today, it's these tiny little rural villages, and you think the birth of America, this nation today that's really made a significant contribution to the world, comes from these tiny little rural villages in England. And,
interesting.
But it was the ideas that came. Anyway, so the Puritans come to America, and let's if we pick up the story there, what struggles do the Puritans have with liberty? 1620, they come here, and we often paint this rosy picture. The Puritans come here because they wanted liberty, and they were fleeing the persecution of England and all these, it's often, in my opinion, painted rather rosily.
Sure.
When the Puritans get here, how rosy is it?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're essentially doing some of the same things that were being done to them in the old country, right? And they come here, with I think good intentions. They were coming to set up New Jerusalem, right? This is the city on the hill. They're like, we're going to make this, God's kingdom on earth. Let's have the 10 Commandments essentially be the law of the land. It sounded good, and they were very convinced that what they had was what God wanted, and they would interpret, everything that happened, and a lot of them were, very Calvinistic as well, and they believed in this idea that they were predestined to be saved, and it was kind of hard to know if you were predestined, but they had some evidences that they would look at and whatever. But it's interesting. I find it interesting that they were pretty hard on each other. At the same time, I have to give them credit. They also forgave, from what I understand, very easily. So if someone was repentant and they were like willing to go along with, what the church or the church leaders and the pastors said, they were brought back in, but if not, there was banishment, there was all sorts of church discipline that it wasn't the kind of church discipline we think of today, at least in free countries where you're disfellowshipped or you're, censured. This was, you're banished from society.
You have to leave the colony or the
because
compound.
the church and the state were very much united, and the political leaders there were political leaders that were doing just that, the magistrate, but then you had the pastors who were again paid by tax dollars, and they were very influential politically. And of course, at some point, only church members could vote, only church members could hold office, right? And
so we're talking here. This is like the 1600s in America, like
right
around. Mm-hmm. And what religion was it? Was it Church of England, or did it vary?
Well, and I think, so it depended where you're looking, right? Up in Massachusetts, I'm pretty sure most of those were, Anglicans or whatever that had come over, and they were, considered themselves, still part of the Church of England, but they had a pure, faith. Then they believed that, I think they believed the church in England had been compromised by popery and, whatever. And so, I think most of it was definitely more of your Anglican faith, but then of course other groups started to eventually come in as well. But you look at people like William Penn, who was a Quaker, right? Quakers were not really accepted within the Puritan community, and he went off and established his own colony, essentially, right? So no, and of course, if you look at what Ellen White in the book The Great Controversy has to say, I think it's fascinating, because she talks about how the reason that the church wants to grasp for political power, this is her analysis of why, is because the church has lost the power to convince people's minds and hearts through the love and power of the truth and the Holy Spirit. And so in order to get people to do what they want them to do, because we all want, correct behavior. And of course we can talk about kind of the, Roger Williams, we mentioned him, his idea of what the church ought to do versus the state. But, her thing is, hey, the church really lost the Spirit of God, lost the power of love. And that's why they reached out and they said, we're going to control you, through civil enactments and so on and so forth.
I think it was Benjamin Franklin, didn't he say, when religion's good, it takes care of itself, or something like that?
Right. Yeah.
So you mentioned Roger Williams. So you got the Puritans, they come here for freedom, or to get away from tyranny. But when they get here, aside from all the other challenges you have, they essentially setting up, their own little compounds or colonies where this is the religion of this town or this city or this area, and anyone who disagrees is not welcome here. But then Roger Williams comes along. How is he different from these? Who was he? Where does he come from to start with?
Yeah, no. So he actually was a protege, you could say, of Mr. Cook in England, who was the great lawyer who helped with establish English common law, and he'd actually paid for Roger Williams' schooling and so on and so forth, right? So he comes over here, and at first he's welcomed, and they actually offered him the church in which church was it? I think it was Boston. I forget which church.
Near Boston.
Was it Boston? Yeah. And so they offer him the church, pastorate there, essentially, right? To be the teacher of the church, I think it was. And
Salem, was it Salem?
Well, I think he went to Salem second. That's what it was. And Salem was where, So the first one was, I think it was Boston or one of the other main cities. And basically he rejects their offer he was kind of this guy who just said it like it was, apparently. And so he basically was like, no, you guys are not pure enough. Wow. He was kind of like, in England, he'd kind of kept it under wraps a little bit. But he came over here and he's like, I'm just done. I'm going to be who I am. And so he comes over here and he really offended the leaders of, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they really were just offended. So then he went down to Salem and he was about to get a job there. And the guys up in Boston were like, no, don't hire this guy, essentially. So he kind of, goes here and there for a while. But essentially, his idea was this, and it was really according to one biographer at least, John Barry, who wrote a really good book called Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul. Excellent book. Barry suggests that Roger Williams was really the first person in history to ever break church and state apart. and to really make that idea something that you actually put into practice in a civil society. And so he argued that, hey, the magistrate had no authority over the first table of the law of God. The 10 Commandments. You've got the first 4 commandments that deal with, a person's relationship to God, and the last 6, which really deal with more of the horizontal relationships between people, right? And he said, listen, the magistrate has no jurisdiction over a person's beliefs and conscience and what they, practice in relation to a deity. And that idea was offensive to the Puritan colonial leaders at that time. And so eventually they were going to send him back to England. And then I think, the theory is that John Winthrop, who was one of at this point, he was a previous governor. They think, sent word secretly to Williams that they're coming to get him. So then he goes out, he's been really sick and all this kind of stuff. He goes out in the middle of winter, and he had made friends with the Native Americans. And so they took him in, and he ended up surviving, of course, establishing what came to be known later as Rhode Island. So, his idea that church and state should be broken apart, very revolutionary, it's never been done before. And
when he came here, did he come here did he emigrate to stay here forever? Or did he just kind of come as whatever? Was he a pastor?
He was, yeah. So he'd been trained as a minister,
okay,
right? And I believe ordained in England, right? And apparently a very, very bright person, educated, I think it was at Cambridge, right?
I think so, yeah. Well, he only had Oxford or Cambridge at the time.
Right, yeah. And just a very, had seen a lot as well within the political realm. And I think he'd seen enough that he just realized this toxic mixture of church and state was a bad idea, right? So he comes here to really escape potential persecution over there.
I guess I'm just trying to form a picture. So he comes here as a minister, but there's already colonies across the eastern seaboard, or town, not colony, but there's towns and stuff. But he's not, in terms of his position amongst everyone else, he's just kind of one pastor of many. It's not like he's seen as a de facto leader by anyone, really,
sure,
is he?
Sure. Well, John Barry in his book describes how when he came, they were excited to have him because he had a reputation of being a really kind of a charismatic person, a good speaker, intelligent, whatever, and very godly, very godly. It's interesting because the idea of separation of church and state nowadays sometimes is associated with being, let's say, godless or,
True. Interesting.
Right. And yet he was extremely devout. He really was. I mean, you can read his diaries and things like that, apparently, or his letters. And he had this very close and, almost emotional relationship with Jesus. And he writes about, how much he loves God. And, it's you can tell he's very much just a devout person. And they were pretty excited to have him. And that's why they offered him the job of teacher at pretty much the main church in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was not this was a big deal. And yet he refuses it. It was incredibly insulting, and so that kind of just set him on the wrong foot from there on out with everybody.
So he leaves there. You said he goes with a native, and so Rhode Island. What place does Rhode Island have in U.S. history for those that aren't familiar?
Well, I think it really becomes his ideas. What he establishes there becomes the seeds for what later become, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, our Bill of Rights. The idea that church and state are separated, and so when James Madison writes, the Bill of Rights. He's really, reaching back and beginning with Roger Williams and others who came after him, taking those ideas and incorporating them there. So
when Roger Williams starts that in Rhode Island, it's I don't know how it's a unique experiment. Would you say?
Yeah, I think so. And it's small, and he, I'm not an expert on everything that happened there, but I think that it was definitely, there's some back and forth, but he had some. Yeah, again, just ideas that I think were really became very influential in the American Republic. Just that concept.
So this is like the first time, really, though. Would you say? You did say it's the first time, really, that this has happened in history.
Up until that time, yeah. So, and his idea really was that forced worship, as we kind of touched on earlier, was he said this. He said, forced worship stinks. He compared, making someone go to church or something like that. He compared it to spiritual rape. He's like, this is a really offensive thing, to God. You're making people hypocrites. You're making them break the commandment that says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." And and his idea caught on. And I think it's interesting that here we had I think some people are surprised that we've had persecution in America before, but no, there's been persecution. I mean, the Puritans, they burn people at the stake every now and then. I mean, not very many, but there've been a few.
Or the witches,
Salem, witch trials and all that. But we've also had just, kind of maybe less, a little more low key type of persecution, but definitely religious intolerance at the beginning there. And he's the guy that we can say, really with him, it began to change, and he brought some ideas to the table that were just really revolutionary.
True.
You need to do a whole episode with someone who actually knows a lot about Roger Williams sometime on that, because that guy, I mean, I don't know if maybe you have already, but we just an amazing guy.
We covered him partly, but yeah, I find him fascinating. And to me, like, he's one pastor of many, but yet it's the ideas that he has that then make him remembered in history. I mean, think about just how many other pastors at the time or spiritual leaders that were looked up to by large congregations. We have no idea who they are. And yet he, his ideas of separation of church and state. But do you know much about like some of the early struggles with like some of the various churches in the East Coast, Baptist churches and so on, with religious persecution and stuff? Do you know?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, so some of those early minority faiths, they did experience persecution, right? And you and I both went to school in Virginia, right? Where I remember not far from the college there was a prison or a little jail cell, if you remember that. I think it was in Orange or something, or Culpeper, I forget where you could go and you could see a plaque or something that, this was where, Baptist ministers would be jailed for preaching without a license, And so people like James Madison and some of those people who ended up writing the Bill of Rights, they actually lived in a society where they saw this happen. They saw the established church, the Episcopal Church or whoever it was, persecute religious minorities. Because, of course, even after, and I think a lot of Americans don't realize this, even after the First Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, of course, that only applied to the federal government. And so individual states had their own established churches oftentimes, and it didn't violate the First Amendment. It wasn't until later on that the federal Constitution was applied to the states, right, after the 14th Amendment, right? But it is interesting that, minority faiths like Baptists and, of course, Quakers, mentioned them a little bit earlier, persecuted, right? People like Ann Hutchinson, who was a Quaker, William Penn, and definitely we've had some intolerance in our history, and we could talk about that when it comes to, even into the 19th century, right? With Sunday laws, things of that nature. We can talk about that.
80s, yeah. Do you think? Yeah, interesting. Anyway, we'll take a break now here for those of you who are tuning in and listening. We're going to take a short break here. We've covered somewhat a broad sweep of history. We're going to look a little bit more about how some of these issues of church and state are involved today, and how as a Christian we can separate between issues we should get involved in, issues we shouldn't get involved in, and try and bring it to some relevance to the day in which we live today. But stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment after this short break.
Lineage is a non-profit organization kept running by generous donors like you. Support us today on patreon.com/Lineage Journey.
"1,500 years before Christ, a young child was born who would later lead the children of Israel out of Egypt to the Promised Land. During that journey, Moses was given the plans to build a portable temple which was used for more than 500 years. The services of this temple gave a vivid portrayal of the results and solution for sin. the redemptive love God had for his people. It pointed to the world's Redeemer, Jesus, the Messiah. Messiah's Mansion is a life-size replica of this temple. Come experience this sanctuary model as a tour guide expertly explains the history of the events that took place in the services long ago, how each step pointed to the work of the Messiah, and how the truths discovered there are relevant to our lives today.
For young people, the question always comes, what's next? Well, here's an idea. CORE. CORE is a discipleship and evangelism training program that runs for 9 months. In that short amount of time, you will learn everything you need to know to become an effective soul winner, as well as having the tools you will need to ensure that your walk with God remains rooted in Jesus Christ. They will teach you how to do and give Bible studies, how to do effective literature evangelism, give you tools to improve your mental health, and how to help others with their struggles too, how to minister to people through health evangelism. And you'll also learn how to engage in cross-cultural missions through a nearly 2-week mission trip, all in the context of a safe and healing community that is there to support you in your journey. For more information, go to coreevangelism.com.
Anyway, thank you for those of you who are tuning in. Thank you for being with us through the break. We're joining here our podcast with Stephen Allred on religious liberty and the development of that idea and its relevance still today. So we've looked a little bit about the past, Magna Carta and so on. So we're here in America. We've looked at how the Puritans came over and they didn't really get the idea of religious liberty. They fled persecution, and then they kind of created persecution for other people. Roger Williams comes along and says, no, we want to have church and state separate. It's a revolutionary new idea. And then it gets enshrined in the Constitution you mentioned.
Yeah. So, of course, we have the actual Constitution that did not include anything about, fundamental rights. And so the founders, some of them said, hey, we need to have a Bill of Rights. And so they amended the Constitution with the First Amendment. Okay. And they put, religion right there at the very beginning. So some people have referred to this, as our first freedom. They really considered it an important thing. Again, the founders, many of them had lived under regimes or been involved in places where there was an established church, established religion. They'd seen religious minorities be persecuted, or people who were deists or atheists or whatever, who didn't want to have any religion whatsoever, experience harassment or persecution. And so the idea is that they said we need to put this first. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So there was this idea that Congress didn't have the ability to influence religion, create it, a religious entity, and nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's kind of this pronged aspect of that: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause.
Like we're not going to set it up, and we're not going to prohibit it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's how unique was this model at the time?
I mean, it was. I'm pretty sure it was one of the first times this had happened, and. What's fascinating is it was a pretty controversial idea.
Was it?
Yeah. And so there's a really good book that your listeners would be interested in. I think it's called The Godless Constitution. And it sounds like maybe a bad book for Christians to read, but it's not. And it's written by 2 guys named Lawrence Moore and Isaac Kramnik. Excellent book. And it really goes through a lot of the history of kind of how our Constitution and our founders ended up leaving God out of the Constitution. The word God is not mentioned there. And in fact, the Constitution, not only had this First Amendment that was controversial, but there's also this idea that no religious test shall be required to hold any office which was, again, completely radical and revolutionary, other than Roger Williams, because there had always been some sort of a church membership or some test. Because hey, you wanted good people in office. You didn't want Jews, Catholics, or Quakers there. That was what the people back then thought were that would be the ultimate bad thing, I guess, right? So, and it's interesting. They talk in the book about how there were some Christian ministers and other people who brought this resolution to the Virginia ratifying committee, because each colony had to ratify the Constitution, right? And their proposition was that Congress should establish schools that were taxpayer funded to teach young people about religion. And this should be part of the Constitution, that the Congress would have religious schools. And, and so for us as Christians, it might say, oh, yeah, it's a good idea. Why not let the government pay for religious education? But the founders rejected that idea. And they really basically said, no, religion should be it should be like a free market thing.
It should support itself.
Support itself. Yeah. The whole idea of capitalism, right? That, you can, create your own business and do your own thing and make money. The whole idea of free market, they really believe that should apply to religion as well. And that was a very controversial thing at the time, but somehow, and I think God really had his hand in it, right? That constitutional amendment passed, it was ratified. And it really set a precedent for that idea going forward, I think, in other nations as well. But very, very important.
Were the founders? Because sometimes you get this question today about the founders and setting up. So I found at least I glean from what you say. The founders of the U.S. were they Christian? Were they deist? Or what was their like? They're believing in God, most of them, if not all of them. They believe in God, and yet they intentionally say we're going to withhold that from the Constitution or whatever.
Right, and I don't know if they, it wasn't a monolithic group. There were people with different opinions, of course, and you had some who actually were interested in kind of keeping things the way they had been, right? My understanding is that, and there is some controversy out there. And again, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on this, but, I've seen some historians say that a lot of them were deists. There were a couple, I think, that might have been maybe Thomas Jefferson, but a lot of them were probably fairly kind of nominal, Christians, if you will. But yeah, probably some deistic kind of ideas with a lot of them, not super devout church going necessarily, but also not atheists, most of them.
That's key,
yeah. So, but yeah, no, I think it was definitely a mix of people, but it wasn't about hostility to religion. And I think this is the part that, a lot of people.
You mentioned earlier about Roger Williams, that he was a devout Christian and very godly man, and yet he very much separated the two,
right?
As opposed to being like, I'm an atheist and I hate God or don't believe in God, and therefore I want him out.
That's why I want church and state separate. No, I mean, Williams, his idea was that whenever the church got involved with the state, that the state would corrupt the church. He talks about the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. He said there should be a wall between them.
I like that phrase. Say that again.
The garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. Yeah. And he talked about the wilderness, there needed to be a wall between the two, because otherwise the church would become like the world. And so yeah, it was Jefferson, of course, who took up that same metaphor, this wall of separation. And he was writing to some Baptists. I think it was the Danbury Baptists. And he talked about, how, we need to have this wall of separation between church and state. But again, the wall of separation back then was really viewed as a way to protect those of minority faith. And that's why you see a lot of folks, how in America, a lot of the minority faiths, Baptists initially, people from our own faith community, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, very much in support of separation of church and state. It really benefited those groups. And I think what here we are now in a time where the Baptists are in the majority, and it's fascinating to see how, there are some Baptists who still hold to that. And yet there are some who don't see the need for it anymore, because, hey, we don't need that wall, right? And so my thing is, well, wait, what is the reason for it to begin with? It's not just about, does it benefit me? Mm-hmm. Is religious freedom only there if it benefits me, or is it there for everybody? So this idea of separation between church and state, I think really it's based on deeper principles than just, being utilitarian, for minority faiths. That's a great benefit, but there are deeper reasons that I think are actually biblical. That
where do you think in the Bible they come from, or what? Yeah.
Well, so I think the idea of freedom of conscience, or the freedom to choose in matters of faith. I mean, you see it right at the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, right?
So, yeah.
I mean, you've got the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, you can say, well, hey, there were consequences there for them sinning. And you're right, there were. And there still will be consequences at the end for the evil, who are destroyed. But the point here, I think that's very important, is there are 2 points. Number one, God respects our choice, right? Number two, we as human beings are not God. And God in the Bible does, I believe, and we can talk about what Jesus said and so on and so forth. He doesn't give us the job of deciding for others in matters of faith, or persecuting them if they don't agree with our views. So I think you see that there, of course, in the very beginning. Of course, when you go to now in the Old Testament, you had a theocracy, and that's a fascinating discussion to have sometime, maybe more than we can get into here, right? God did reign directly through prophets and kings and so on and so forth, right? And yet I would argue that the reason that, for example, in those contexts, sometimes there was the death penalty for people who were blaspheming or whatever it was that God knows the heart, and he was the one who was directing what was happening. But then you get to the New Testament, and Jesus says there's a clear shift, right?
From the theocracy.
Where Jesus says, my kingdom now is not of this world, right? There's a really great, in the book, Patriarchs and Prophets, some of your listeners might know about this book. If you don't know about it, it's a great book. In the back of the book, there's an appendix called, what's the name of it? I think it's called On the Question of Theocracy or something. And it's written by the editors, but it's an excellent, maybe 5-page read that is just a really good overview of kind of this shift and why and how, and from a biblical standpoint, how this shift took place and kind of the why behind it. But so you see Jesus coming along, and he's standing in front of Pilate, and he's saying, hey, I'm not a threat to you politically, because my kingdom's from a different realm. So don't worry about me. If my kingdom were from here, my servants would be taking up the sword to fight. And I think Jesus and the early Christians interpreted that as being a very clear kind of very clear marching orders for them, that they were not to, use political power to force others in matters of faith, right? Jesus, of course, tells the scribes and the Pharisees, hey, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God's what is God's. He gives them kind of this, like, there's a separation here. There's a difference between the two realms. So yeah, no, I think that these ideas are there in the Bible. And I think when you get towards the end of the Bible as well, you see God giving us this imagery of an apostate fallen church being united with the kings of the earth. And it's toxic. It leads to persecution. Yeah. And so there's clearly, it's a bad idea in Scripture for this to happen. So, and there's a lot more I think we could talk about, but that's kind of a...
Yeah. I mean, I find it, I'm sure you've observed, like Jesus himself, he lives at a time when there's it's a hyper politically charged society. And yet he never gets involved in the sense of trying to angle himself for a leadership position or whatever, which...
To get power. Yeah, he's never interested in political power.
Yeah. In that regard, yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question about today. How involved... So we talk about the separation of church and state, and I think that's, we've seen that from, say, Roger Williams. You see it, as you mentioned, in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It's a key foundational principle of American society. And I believe one of the the reasons as to why America has been successful. That they tried this new experiment and it actually worked.
Yeah.
It worked for the church, and you had a plethora of religions that have formed here and grown, and it worked for the state too. But are there any areas where the church can get involved with matters of the state? And you did allude to it earlier when you talked about the two laws, but what can the church get involved in? Or what has the church got involved in and still being true to its identity?
To this idea. Yeah. I mean, and let's just be honest, the reality is that today in America, if we can just kind of talk about what I think what most people are thinking is, to a lot of American Christians, and I'll speak just, from where, my perspective and what I'm hearing, they feel like the idea of separation of church and state has really failed the church, because they look at the state of the world and they say, man, there's immorality and there's all this, confusion about, sexuality and the morals that surround that. And we have a lot of, things that we need to fix in our society. And we as the church need to be doing that. And I would say, amen. I agree. The question is, how do we do that? And so Christians, if we're going to go back to that Puritan model, which I don't think has ever really died out completely. It's always been kind of around under the surface. I mean, if you look at American, just kind of our, the talk that you hear, it's always kind of been there. There have been those who have been trying to kind of make that come back, I guess you could say. And I feel like that, those ideas are still there. We need to impose, our ideas of faith and morality on others. And I would say, I think there's a fine line to walk there. So if we could talk about kind of our faith community for a minute, is that okay to do on this podcast? Because I know you've got listeners who probably aren't part of this faith community, but well, before we get there, let me just say this. I think the mission of the church, I think you'd agree, Adam, is, primarily to seek and save the lost, right? To take the gospel, go make disciples of all the nations, share the everlasting gospel. That is our primary mission. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think so when it comes to, issues on the earth and political issues, it's like, so where do we know when to get involved? And I like to think of it too in the context of the two great commandments, right? Love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. All right, so then how do we love our neighbor? And to me, that's where sometimes we're going to get involved in political issues, because loving people, means caring about their problems and what they're going through. And the Bible gives us lots of admonition to, help the suffering and the oppressed. I mean, just read Isaiah 58, Proverbs 31, what verses? Verses 8 and 9, right? So all throughout Scripture, there are those admonitions. And but I think the distinction that I see between doing it the right way and the wrong way is when we're loving our neighbor, we're trying to help them, as opposed to we're trying to get power to impose upon people. I think it's a power thing, is what I see as being a distinction. And if you look at Ellen White, she really does make that distinction. She talks about when the church loses the power of two things: the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and love. She reaches for the strong arm of the state.
Interesting.
And I feel like the state is kind of like it's the church's mistress, or, well, in this case, it's the kings of the earth, with the church. But it's this idea of it's a spiritual adultery thing. When the church has left her first lover, Christ, she reaches for the state, the kings of the earth, to do what Christ should be doing for her and through her. So talk about early Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, of course, started in the 1860s, but prior to that, it really grew up out of the Civil War, right? And so prior to that, we had a lot of abolitionists. Right. And so they were very politically involved with that issue, which they said, hey, this is about freeing people from slavery. This is something that we as Christians ought to be doing.
Because it's a biblical principle of equality and so on.
Yeah, and it's the Bible tells us that we should do this, and so they took and I feel like this is a principle that I feel comfortable understanding, and that is that if as the church goes, If the church is just like, hey, we're another political lobbying machine, that's to me pretty obviously not something God calls us to do. But if the church is saying, hey, this is a biblical principle that the Bible speaks about, we need to talk about this, and it also happens to step on some political toes. It happens to be a political issue because, I mean, pretty much everything's political, right? Nowadays, it seems like when you talk about any social issue, well, we're not going to be partisan about it. We're not going to be saying we're taking a political partisan side, but we're going to talk about the issue. And we're going to advocate for it. I mean, Ellen White, in her book, Thoughts on the Mount of Blessings, I have a little quote here that you've probably read. She talks about a religion that leads us to be careless of human needs, sufferings, or rights is a spurious or false religion, right? And she goes on to describe kind of more about that. So the Adventists were involved in abolitionism. Later on, they got into the temperance work, right, which dealt with the prohibition of alcohol. Which you're like, that's a pretty invasive political issue, right? You're like, I'm gonna tell you can't buy, sell, make, or drink alcohol, but they're like, no, this is something God has called us to do because it's really ripping our society apart. People are just completely destroying families, whatever, and they really got involved with that to the point where Ellen White even said to Adventists, hey, go vote on Sabbath if you have to stop this. And then even after slavery ended, Ellen White was very vocal about racism. Controversial issue. I mean, in the South, she was also cautious about, hey, we need to be, able to reach the people in the South who are racist or, whatever, in the former Confederacy who didn't like black people or whatever. But she also was very vocal herself. I mean, she spoke out against it. And I think she saw it as an issue that was a justice issue the church should properly speak out about, right?
And then we see the church, I guess, gets involved again. Maybe not so much our church, but Christianity at least gets involved to a certain extent into civil rights as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting.
I like that. Anyway, come back to, like you mentioned, the church to get involved in areas where it's bringing equality or justice to people as opposed to a power grab of itself. I really like that kind of delineation. But anyway, sorry, you were going to say.
Well, back to that point, though, I think let me throw this out there, too. So Francis D. Nichol, who you're probably familiar with, he was one of the editors of the Adventist Review, and I think in the 1930s and 40s or something, he wrote a book called Answers to Objections. In that book, he has some good, actually really interesting thoughts on separation of church and state. And one of the things he writes about is, there was somebody who wrote to him and said, hey, how can you Adventists say that you're for separation of church and state and still advocate for the prohibition of alcohol? Isn't that imposing your moral views on other people in a way that's against your principles of staying aloof from, political issues and keeping church and state separate? I thought that's a fascinating question. It's a good question, right? And so he kind of argued it like this. He said, listen, we as Christians ought to be able to get involved as citizens of society to make the world a better place, to do justice, as long as we can argue with principles that are not, we're not going to take the Bible and beat the Bible over people's heads and say we need to legislate the Bible as the law of the land. He said basically we need to find sufficient justification for what we're arguing for on civil grounds alone. And so it's kind of this idea that we as society generally share some common principles, and we as Christians, his point was, ought to go out and argue for whatever we're trying to advance. That's a good thing. Based on those principles we can share with people. Can we use the Bible? Sure, but we shouldn't try to legislate it as the law of the land. That was his position. And I think I like that. I think there's also areas where, again, Roger Williams is like, the first 4 commandments are off limits. The government should never involve itself in,
Do you think that's pretty much a safe guideline to go from still today? The first 4 commandments is us and God. The last 6 the government gets involved in.
And again, I think everyone has to vote their conscience. For me, that is, I think, at least the minimum, standard. I think, and I argue this in a book I wrote a couple of years ago, because these are issues I think you have to wrestle with a little bit. And one of the things that actually a friend of mine, he suggested, was that there's public morality and then there's private morality, right? And his point was public morality are things that people do or don't do that affect other people. Okay. The government should have fair game. Christians should be able to advocate on those issues and say, hey, this is wrong. You're hurting someone else. Hey, murder, obviously public morality, stealing, theft, whatever, same thing. Right. Then he talked about private morality. Private morality is where you might be doing something that I would consider wrong, but it's not hurting me. It's not hurting anyone else. Maybe it's between consenting adults, and at what point should I or the church advocate for laws to enforce things that I think ought to be, there from a private morality standpoint? And so I think for me, I do see some things even on the second table that maybe aren't really something I'm going to maybe be as excited about advocating for, because I think and here's why. I think a lot of non-Christians view Christianity as being all about power. They're out there to force their views on me. Is that, and is it really the goal to say, well, we just want to get other people to have to conform with laws so they don't, do X, when that really isn't affecting anyone except for themselves? Is that really, so Roger Williams, actually, it's fascinating. He actually argued against laws that prohibited gambling and cards and things like that, even though you could argue those are on the second table, right, of the law. But he said, yeah, that shouldn't be the government's concern. That's more of a conscience issue. People want to do that. It's not hurting anybody else if they're consenting. You could argue gambling does hurt people, but anyway, I think it's a little
nuances.
There are some nuances. Yeah.
What in the US today, what would you say are some of the present challenges to, or even further afield from the US, to these principles that have been enshrined? Are they being, we sometimes hear about the wall of separation. Is it being chipped away or taken apart brick by brick, or is there
Yeah, I think it is. I think there have always been challenges to it. I think I'm a little older than you, Adam, but you probably remember back in the 90s, right, with the religious right, right? And the whole, you had the idea of separation of church and state. There are people who really dislike that idea. And, within the religious community, within Christianity here in America, you've heard people say, oh, it's not in the Constitution. And it's true. The phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution any more than, the term millennium is in the Bible, or, whatever term you want to. So I think but the idea, I think, is there. And if you look at the context of the founders, they definitely understood what Roger Williams was saying. He said that for sure, and so did Thomas Jefferson and others. But that idea has been very controversial, and so there are challenges to that. And I think nowadays it's interesting how it's morphed. And the Supreme Court today, there are justices on the Supreme Court who do not believe in the idea of separation of church and state. It's fascinating. The United States Supreme Court. There's at least one justice who, from my understanding, believes that it would probably be okay for individual states to have an established church.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting. And he's an originalist. He believes that we should go back to the original Constitution the way the founders understood it. And he's right. If you're to look at the Constitution from the way the founders understood it, it applied to the federal government alone and not to the churches until the 14th Amendment came along in the 1860s, right? And states should be able to have their own church established religions if they wanted. So, but that idea, has, I think, led to now where we have a majority of justices who definitely lean in the anti-church and state direction. And so some of the recent rulings in the last 10 years have been very fascinating because, and to me, they've been somewhat alarming in this area, because you see, this idea that government can now fund religious education directly. And that's okay. And so the litmus test that the court is now using to decide religious liberty cases, Establishment Clause cases. Okay, so we're talking about the Establishment Clause, right? So you have the Establishment Clause, which is the government can't establish or favor or fund directly a religion. That's kind of the historical idea, at least in the last 60, 70 years. But now the idea is we're going to look at our history and tradition to decide these cases. Where you're like, okay, our history and tradition has not always been that great when it comes to this. I mean, we've had Sunday blue laws on the books.
Yeah.
We've put people in jail for breaking those blue laws. We've had other things that we have not been very nice to religious minorities sometimes, when it comes to their rights. And so I think to me, that is a concerning thing. You can talk to some legal scholars, and I don't claim to be a legal scholar, although I'm an observer and I'm an attorney who, I work to some extent in that area. And they are, they'll say, man, the wall of separation is gone. I mean, the Establishment Clause, you could say, is pretty much been obliterated. I think on the popular culture side, you see it as well. It's fascinating. You see a lot of folks who are saying we need to get God back into government, and it's a good motive. I understand where they're coming from. I don't disagree with their heart.
Is that the term Christian nationalism? How does that play into this?
Well, and that is a term that some people I think consider it kind of a pejorative term. But then you've seen some lawmakers on the national level who are adopting that label.
They're owning it. Yeah.
They're like, yeah, that's me. I'm a Christian nationalist. I think it was Senator Josh Hawley who recently did that. Lauren Boebert, who's a congressman from Colorado, she has very openly disparaged the separation of church and state and said it's a stupid idea or something like that, and then you've got, even government think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, who are very well funded, a lot of very influential people involved there who are, kind of writing the proposed actions and laws for a conservative administration. And they're saying, hey, Project 2025, you may have heard of that. They're saying, hey, Congress should, encourage a day of rest. Sunday is, the Lord's Day. And so for me now, okay, that might be kind of innocuous. Okay, they're just encouraging it. But should Congress have anything to do with a religious day of rest? I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't think that from a constitutional standpoint, it should, and definitely from a biblical and a Christian standpoint. Even if, let's say they were getting the day right. I mean, Adam, would we want that? Would we want, a government to force people to go to church even on the right day?
Yeah. You should fight that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I don't think that would be a good thing.
So, and we don't have time to delve into this because this could be a whole hour-long Bible study. But in a nutshell, where do you see this playing out, or where are we headed based on?
And this is the thing. I think the Bible gives us a big picture with some detail. If you, give stock to what Ellen G. White said, she likes to color in a lot of the detail on that in her books on Bible prophecy. Fascinating books like The Great Controversy. If you start in the Bible, what I see, Adam, is I see, and it's fascinating because I think a lot of Christians are like, hey, what's going on right now? Our country, our world's going to hell in a handbasket, immorality, all this weird stuff with, people are confused about, sexuality. And I'm like, yeah, it's true, right? We have bad things happening. And so they see the enemy being secularism and atheism and these ideologies that are being taught to their kids in school, right? Which are concerning, no doubt. So I'm not in any way dismissing that. But I see Bible prophecy, honestly, and tell me if you agree, you can disagree with me, skipping over a lot of that and really going to the devil's end game. I do see in Daniel 11, and I know I think a mutual friend of ours, Norman McNulty, has written a book about Daniel. He talks about Daniel 11. It's fascinating in there. A lot of Bible scholars, of course, have, but he mentions there the king of the north, king of the south, right? The traditional view. I mean, you've got different views on that, but just to kind of summarize it quickly, king of the south representing, kind of secularism, atheism, king of the north representing, institutionalized religious, Catholicism, Christianity, apostate Christianity. Who wins? It's not the king of the south. King of the north wins. Revelation 13 picks up on that, and you got the U.S., that transforms from a nation with two lamb-like horns that speaks like the dragon into a false prophet that does miracles and is the most active agent at the end of time, even more than the first beast, I think, according to Revelation 13, in enforcing false worship, right? It's about false worship here. It's very interested in, and it has to be about counterfeit Christianity because it calls the Antichrist the son of perdition. Well, that's referring to Judas. That's the only other place, right? And he was a insider. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't an atheist. He was on the inner circle. The other thing I see is here, real quick, in Revelation 17, you've got the woman. Now, who's the woman? We know who the woman is.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys have done episodes on.
Yeah.
The woman has been here for how long? Centuries. It's the same woman in Revelation 17 that's been here all along. It's not a new woman. It's not, it's not the Marxist woman now or the atheist woman or the secularist woman now. This is the same woman. She's the church, the apostate church. And what is she doing in Revelation 17? She's riding
the beast.
The beast. Who's in control?
The woman.
The woman, right? And this is where I'm like, the woman's off the beast for a while, but at the very end, she gets back on that beast and she is in control. Ellen White, she makes this very clear. Let me actually read you something real quick. You've read this. You're the Great Controversy expert, man. But I mean, Great Controversy 443, she says, in order for the United States to form an image of the beast, that's referring to Revelation 13, the religious power must so control the civil government that the authority of the state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. And she's in that context referring to apostate Protestantism and, Catholicism. And then she says, when the Protestant churches shall unite with the secular power to sustain a false religion, when the state shall use its power to enforce the decrees and sustain the institutions of the church, then will Protestant America have formed an image to the beast, right? Anyway, all that to say, I see, what the Bible paints to me is that false Christianity is going to be the main player at the end of time. Now, the end game is that Jesus is going to save his people. And we can't lose sight of that. I think, I grew up where I heard a lot about the end of times, but we didn't talk about Jesus coming back as much as I think we should have.
Yeah.
He's going to deliver his people. That's the good news. So what do we do as God's people in this context? And I think that we are called to love God with all our hearts, and that includes obeying his commandments, and love people as we love ourselves. And that includes doing justice in the world. And we're not here to grab power. We're here to save people and help them get to heaven, right?
Amen. It's a fascinating subject. I think
when
you look at the beginning, the challenges we've had, the challenges we're having at the minute, and like you say, the contemporary challenges where people are saying we need to do away with this, or it's something, the concept of liberty, I think, is something that's always been fought over. And the concept of freedom has always been something that the idea of freedom has to be fought over. So thank you for sharing some of your thoughts on this. I mean, like you said, we can't cover much, but you have written a book though on this, right?
Well, my book is...
this one here.
It is, yeah. It's on some of this. Actually, the last, I'd say 3 chapters do touch on a lot of the prophetic stuff.
Issues,
yeah, absolutely. Church and state. So, you can get it on Amazon if you're interested.
Do Justice, the case for biblical social justice.
Yeah.
What would you, aside from this, I haven't read it yet, but thanks for the copy. I'll take a look at. What are some of the resources that you would recommend to someone watching or listening, any podcast or books to read that will kind of give them a little bit more detail on this subject?
Yeah, good question. So I know, we, the Seventh Day Adventist Church, I believe it's the North American Division, publishes I think it's a monthly, it might be bi-monthly, periodical called Liberty Magazine.
Okay.
Excellent resource. Really, I'd say thoughtful and researched and balanced perspective on a lot of these issues and very up to date. So definitely a good resource, and it's, $8 a year or something to subscribe to it. It's cheap. They also have a podcast. In fact, it's called Just Liberty. And a good friend of mine, Alan Reinach, and Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty, they host that.
Oh, okay.
It's relatively new, but they get into some really good stuff. And a lot of the things we're talking about here today, they get into more of the legal analysis and so on and so forth. But yeah, so many good books. I mean, I'd say, that the book I mentioned earlier, The Godless Constitution, it's a great just kind of primer on the separation of church and state issue and the history of it. Not a long read. It's maybe, I don't know, 150 pages or 200 pages. But if the one about Roger Williams as well, excellent book.
Oh, okay.
Quite a bit longer, but very interesting book. And I do have one other one too, and it's out of print. Although I was just looking earlier today because I was anticipating, kind of sharing some resources. It's called Dateline Sunday, and it's a history of Sunday laws by a guy named Warren Johns. And he published it, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It is an amazing book, and it shows the history of kind of religious freedom in America from a perspective of a religious minority, you could say. Anyway, it's available on Amazon, and I think he reprinted it recently, and it's a good book. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing. For those of you who are watching or listening, those are some. We'll put those in the description, I believe. But thank you for sharing. Appreciate you sharing on this idea of liberty, religious liberty, freedom of conscience. And for those of you who've listened and have tracked our Lineage series, we pray that you will continue to study more and that you will also be advocates for liberty and freedom of conscience as well. So thank you, Stephen, for being with us. May God continue to bless you in your work, as you fight for the freedom for other people and advocate their case as well. For those of you who have been listening to this Lineage Journey podcast, thank you for tuning in. And each month we have another podcast on a subject of interest that looks at history and how it applies today and what are some of the lessons as well. So thank you, Stephen, for being with us. And
thank you. Appreciate it.
God bless you.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. Lineage Journey is supported by your generous donations. Did you know that you can donate on a monthly basis? Any amount from $2 to $100 or whatever you decide through patreon.com/Lineage Journey. Your donations go towards the cost of producing our varied content, and we thank you for your support.